Hey guys, just a quick pre-video warning. I'm sure you know this is a Bridgerton-centered analysis, but with that comes spoilers. In this, I mention events from both season 2 of the show and Anthony's book, The Viscount Who Loved Me. Also, this might sound a little more formal than what my typical audience is used to hearing from me, but blame that on my script being my final essay for my critical theory class. If you didn't know, I'm an English major with a minor in history, and the B's in this series was how Freud's trauma theory clicked for me. Basically, I was going insane while researching this and wanted to share. Thank you for clicking on the video, and I hope you enjoy. Anthony Bridgerton had always known he would die young. Our first look into what rattled on in the stoic Viscount Anthony Bridgerton's mind was his awareness of mortality. The earlier quote was the very first line of his story in Julia Quinn's Bridgerton series, Anthony's being the second of the 8-novel franchise that was later adapted into a Netflix show back in 2020. Each book explores one of the 8 Bridgerton siblings as they navigate Regency-era London with familial prestige and on the hunt for their own happily ever afters. While Anthony was the eldest sibling and held the title of Viscount after the passing of their father, his story came after his sister's happy marriage when he realized that, at 28 years old, he only had 10 years left to marry and produce an heir. He wasn't terminally ill or anything, only that he was thoroughly convinced that he was doomed to repeat the same fate his father had met, dying by the age of 38 and perhaps by the stinger of a honeybee. Anthony had always known he would inherit the Bridgerton fortune and title, as was typical of the male primogeniture hierarchy practiced at the time. As the firstborn, he prided himself with having the ability to know his father longer than the 7 siblings that followed. His childhood was filled with hikes and horseback rides with father, Edmund, all while studying hard and shadowing the same man in hopes of making his greatest inspiration proud. When Anthony was old enough to attend university, he discovered the joys of women and began his life as a rake, a man known to sleep around with several women such as actresses or opera singers, which eventually became a coping mechanism of sorts after he assumed the role of Viscount. That summer, Anthony returned home to discover that his father had died from a mere bee sting. He refused to believe such news, obviously. After all, both he and his father had been stung before, and they were fine. However, Edmund was allergic, and especially given the lack of medical knowledge at the time, it would have been impossible to detect said allergy until after the subject had already died from the sting. Edmund was the strongest man Anthony knew, the sole man he looked up to and wished to mold his own life after. But suddenly, at the age of 18, Anthony became the next Viscount Bridgerton and was left with 6 young siblings, a distraught, heavily pregnant mother, and tasked to pick up the pieces of his father's death all alone. Shortly after Edmund's death, Anthony's mother, Violet, went into labor with some complications, and as the man of the household, the doctor asked Anthony to choose who shall be sacrificed should the need arise. Like the 18-year-old he was, he didn't know how to respond. But thankfully, both Violet and Anthony's new baby sister, Hyacinth, were unscathed by the end. The book dives into this time by talking about how Anthony had to pick up the slack as parent to his now 7 siblings, as his mother was so downtrodden after Edmund's death that she never even had the energy to hold baby Hyacinth, because it would remind her of how much she missed her husband. This might be the reason why, both in his book and throughout the show, Anthony seems to have a soft spot for his youngest sister. There is a special bond between them due to the circumstances of her birth in the first 11 years of her life, her age when the show begins. Jonathan Bailey, the actor for Anthony in Netflix's adaptation, once said in an interview in 2020, quote, "There will be a time where there will be a 45-year-old Anthony walking Hyacinth down the aisle," end quote. Anthony will be taking on a role typically meant for the bride's father, but he will be the only paternal figure Hyacinth will ever know, a point the book emphasizes by saying that she will never know what it was like to be held by her actual father. The show also alludes to their bond in more subtle ways, such as Anthony asking Hyacinth for a dance when only the Sharmas and Lady Danbury attended his mother's ball back in season 2, a strange decision as attendees under the age of 18 were not permitted at balls. There was also the time where Hyacinth dashed to hug Anthony after he and his wife returned from their honeymoon in season 3, while their siblings beelined to his wife. Their father-daughter-like bond can show the drastic changes Anthony had to go through at a young age in the wake of Edmund's death. He not only became a member of the peerage, he had to grow up and become a father to his siblings, which might be why he was so attached to the rake lifestyle back in season 1. When he found pleasure in women and spirits, he was Anthony. When he wasn't, he was Viscount Bridgerton. Those moments with Sienna and all of the other women he was shown with were brief pauses from the constant nagging of his duties. Anthony never forgot about the bees. In fact, they became a deep-sorted source of trauma for the young man. After that fateful summer, the family left their country home to stay in London until the season Anthony decided to search for a wife. In fear of repeating his mother's grief after Edmund's death, he swore to find someone that he would never fall in love with, not wanting to leave behind another incapacitated wife and mother. So he narrowed down his list of eligible young ladies to Edwina Sheffield, Edwina Sharma in the Netflix adaptation, but ran into a stubborn bump in the road: her sister Kate. Kate despised Anthony due to his reputation as a player, but the Viscount was just as headstrong and courted Edwina anyway, all while trying to impress Kate, just to get her off his back. However, he made the mistake of showing too much of the real him, the loving brother instead of the sleazy Viscount, and when the family invited the Sheffields to their country home for the first time since Edmund's death, a honeybee sought to ruin Anthony's life once again. The mere sight set him into a panic attack, hyperventilating with haunting flashbacks of Edmund's body as the bee sat on Kate's chest before stinging her. While depictions of this encounter between the two sources vary, it eventually leads to the two realizing their feelings for each other. But what do bees have to do with romance and death? Why are they a recurring presence throughout Anthony's story in the book and the show? Well, bees have carried certain meanings in literature since the ancient poets. A poem from the Anacreontea? I don't know, it'll be on screen here. It's essentially just a collection of poems by unknown Greek authors from around the 1st century, but it was found to be perhaps one of the first works to explain both the eroticism and suffering bees symbolize. The poem depicts Eros, the god of lust and sensual love, who receives his first bee sting. After he runs to his mother, Aphrodite, she replies, quote, "If you suffer from the pricks of a bee, how much do you think they suffer, Eros, those whom you strike?" End quote. Aphrodite downplays her son's pain from a bee to the suffering of the humans his arrows hit, equating the god of lust to an insect. Perhaps that is where the phrase "the birds and the bees" comes from, or perhaps the phrase is a play on the fact that bees pollinate flowers, an act of fertilization. Bees are linked with sensual activity and fertility in literature, which could be why Kate's sting brings both her and Anthony together in every version of their story. Anthony needed a wife to produce an heir with, after all, and he certainly had his fair share of suspiciously sensual thoughts about Kate despite dating her sister. Bees have also always been linked with death. In ancient Greece, Rome, and Egypt, honey was often incorporated into funerary rituals, but especially in Greece, bees were seen as chthonic entities, almost as high as the gods. In her book, The Honeybee and the Apian Imagery in Classical Literature, Rachel D. Carlson says, quote, "Honeybees serve as a liminal creature that is just as much associated with human life on Earth as it is with the underworld and the death or birth of the soul." End quote. With the symbolism of death and rebirth in mind, it makes sense that while Edmund died by the stinger of a honeybee, Anthony discovers the love of his life by the stinger of another. Not to mention that once a honeybee stings, they die immediately after. Anthony's feelings for Kate did not come out of thin air. During their rivalry, he had always held more scandalous dreams and thoughts about her as well. Sigmund Freud claims that dreams convey one's innermost desires, no matter how wrong it is. Not long after setting his sights on Edwina, Anthony has a sexual dream of a mysterious woman in his bed. It wasn't until the end of his dream that he saw her face, Kate. He woke with a fright, worried by just how much he enjoyed the dream. They were supposed to be rivals. His plan was to marry her sister. Why would he be having those sorts of dreams about Kate? Try as he might, Anthony could not shake the scandalous thoughts about Kate from his mind, even when awake and actively pursuing Edwina. He'd be caught staring at Kate, relishing in her signature smell of soap and lilies when she walks by. In Anthony's case, the id and superego were at war. He knew his feelings and dreams about Kate were wrong, and he knew that he had the duty of finding the perfect Viscountess to fulfill. but his sex drive was beckoning him towards the sister of the woman he planned to court. After ending things with Edwina, no matter how messy their breakup was in either the show or the book, he did not hold back from acting on his salacious thoughts with Kate, though they never consummated their relationship until their wedding night per societal expectations. As a rake, Anthony never seemed to be one for propriety until he physically held himself back from, in society's eyes, ruining Kate. All in all, Anthony seems to be a perfect amalgamation of Freud's findings. His heat-filled dreams of Kate and their very real kisses and touches pre-marriage, initiated by Anthony, of course, were an example of Anthony's pleasure principle, where one seeks immediate gratification, like eating candy or performing certain scandalous activities. At the same time, his adamance on finding a wife he'd never fall for the sake of never repeating the grief his mother had gone through, was his death drive, defined as seeking to repeat or anticipate suffering, like watching a horror movie. He was fixated on Kate while courting Edwina and repressed his feelings to the best of his abilities, though seemingly everyone in the show, except the sisters and Anthony, could easily tell that he was infatuated with Kate. All of this eventually led to his happiness with Kate, but he still suffered from the memories of his father's death. When the bee that led to the discovery of the fire between Anthony and his future wife had stung her, the flashbacks of his father and Anthony's panic almost caused the two to kiss, a case of the repressed returning. Another point for Freud. Anthony tried to deny his feelings for the woman, as did she with her feelings, but that bee ended up being the catalyst to a loving marriage. In the book, reeling from the realization of loving Kate with the idea of his own death in 9 years, Anthony runs and continues to repress how he truly feels for his new wife, until he catches Kate almost die herself. Faced with the new fear of her passing away, he confesses everything, including the tale of Edmund and Anthony's resulting trauma. It was the fair thing to do in his eyes, warning her about their limited time together. But then Kate reasoned with him by saying that he should not let that fear hold him back from being happy with her, as happy as she wished to be with him. While he would never stop fearing his premature death until his 39th birthday, the promise of spending it with the woman he loved, of making the most of his time on Earth with Kate and their eventual children, provided him a happy ending. In the same source, the very cause for their marriage was a bee stinging Kate. He never would have found that happiness if it weren't for that bee. In conclusion, bees are everywhere in Bridgerton. CGI ones fly through windows at least once in every season of the Netflix show, while tiny ones are embroidered on the men's waistcoats. In Season 2, at Violet's ball, a chalk drawing of a bee is on the ballroom floor, despite the family's logo being a deer instead of an insect. And, of course, Anthony's entire story of love and loss revolves around the bee. The bee's inclusion in not only this franchise, but in literature as a whole, has always balanced between life and death. They can mean fertility and new beginnings, sensuality, or suffering and impending funerals. Anthony's story is a prime example of a bee's multiple meanings and how trauma is just as sticky as the honey in a hive. No matter how much one tries to wash it off, there will always be remnants. Anthony Bridgerton might have suffered a great loss from a bee's stinger, but he also found a great love and a happily ever after by the stinger of another.